August 15th, 2026. I was monitoring international energy flows when something unprecedented appeared in the data. Venezuela had just signed the largest oil deal in its history, a 25-year agreement worth $340 billion with a consortium of Chinese, Russian, and Indian companies. But this wasn't just another energy contract. It represented the physical transfer of oil reserves that had been under de facto American control for decades, moving them permanently into the sphere of influence of countries building alternatives to the Western financial system. The timing couldn't have been more symbolic. August 15th marked exactly 55 years since Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, ending the Bretton Woods system and launching the era of pure fiat currency dominance. Now, on that same date, we were witnessing the beginning of the end of the petrodollar system that replaced gold backing with oil backing. My contact at a major energy trading firm put it simply, this is not just Venezuela switching partners. This is the moment when control of global oil reserves shifted from west to east permanently. We're watching the largest wealth transfer in modern history happen in real time. But here's what made this truly historic. The Venezuela pivot wasn't an isolated geopolitical event. It was the predictable final stage of a pattern that has repeated throughout history whenever empires built on debt, monetary manipulation, and military expansion reached the limits of their sustainability. We're witnessing the same cycle that destroyed Rome, bankrupted Spain, and ended British global dominance, just happening faster due to modern communication and financial systems. Understanding the debt empire collapse cycle. History reveals that empires built on financial privilege rather than productive capacity follow predictable patterns of decline. The Venezuela operation represents stage 5 of this cycle, the moment when critical resources slip from imperial control into the hands of rising powers. Stage 1, innovation and growth. Foundation period. A rising power develops superior military technology, economic systems, or organizational methods that create genuine advantages over competitors. This phase features real productivity growth, technological advancement, and expansion based on superior capabilities. America experienced this from 1776 to 1945, culminating in unmatched industrial capacity, technological leadership, and military power that provided legitimate foundations for global influence. Stage 2, monetary privilege establishment, dominance period. Military and economic success leads to international acceptance of the empire's currency, creating home seigniorage, benefits where the empire can import goods by printing money rather than producing equivalent value. The Bretton Woods system, 1944-1971, established dollar dominance when America held most global gold reserves and represented 50% of world GDP, making dollar acceptance rational for other countries. Stage 3, overextension and financialization, abuse period. Easy money creation tempts the empire to finance consumption and military expansion beyond productive capacity. The economy shifts from producing goods to manipulating financial instruments while debt accumulates exponentially. America entered this phase after 1971 when ending gold convertibility allowed unlimited money printing to finance Vietnam War costs, Great Society programs, and eventually financialized economic growth based on debt expansion rather than productivity increases. Stage 4, weaponization and coercion, desperation period. As economic fundamentals deteriorate, the empire increasingly uses monetary privilege as a weapon to maintain control, forcing other nations to seek alternatives to reduce their vulnerability to financial coercion. We've clearly been in this stage since 2008, with accelerating use of sanctions, swift exclusions, and secondary sanctions that punish countries for maintaining normal business relationships with sanctioned nations. Stage 5, resource loss and system fragmentation, terminal period. Critical resources and strategic partnerships slip from imperial control as rising powers offer better terms without political conditions. This stage features rapid system change as alternatives reach sufficient scale to replace imperial systems. Venezuela's $340 billion pivot to the China-Russia-India consortium represents the beginning of Stage 5, where physical control of critical resources transfers from the declining empire to rising powers building alternative systems. The historical pattern: Rome, Spain, and Britain. Understanding how previous debt empires collapsed provides crucial context for recognizing the same pattern in America's current trajectory. Rome, from republic to collapse, 264 BC, 476 AD. Rome's expansion was initially financed through conquest that brought more wealth than it cost to acquire. But by 100 AD, military campaigns cost more than they generated, while currency debasement funded unsustainable consumption. The turning point came when Germanic tribes began demanding Roman citizenship and land rights, rather than accepting client status. Rome's attempt to maintain control through military force while debasing currency to pay soldiers created the hyperinflation and political chaos that fragmented the Western Empire. The pattern: productive expansion, monetary manipulation, military overextension, resource loss, system collapse. Spain, Silver Empire to bankruptcy, 1492 to 1700. Spanish control of American silver mines created the world's first global currency through the pieces of 8 that were accepted from Manila to London. But instead of investing silver wealth in productive capacity, Spain used it to finance European wars and bureaucratic expansion. The breaking point came when English and Dutch control of Caribbean trade routes allowed them to capture Spanish silver through piracy and competitive commerce. By 1640, more Spanish silver flowed to Amsterdam than Madrid, financing Spain's competitors, while Spain borrowed against future silver production at unsustainable interest rates. Spanish America's independence movements, 1810-1825, represented stage 5 physical loss of the resources that had financed Spanish imperial expansion, leading to permanent decline in Spanish global influence. Britain, industrial power to financial manipulation, 1760-1945. British dominance was initially based on superior industrial technology and naval power that created genuine economic advantages. But by 1914, Britain was financing imperial expansion through debt, while competitors like Germany and America developed superior industrial capacity. The turning point came when America demanded British gold reserves as payment for World War II materials through Lend-Lease, transferring monetary dominance from London to Washington. The 1967 pound devaluation confirmed that sterling's international status had become artificial, maintained through political arrangements rather than economic fundamentals. British resource loss occurred gradually as colonies gained independence, 1947, 1970, while choosing economic relationships with America rather than maintaining ties to financially weakened Britain. The pattern confirmed, in every case, the empire's decline accelerated when critical resources transferred from imperial control to rising powers that offered better economic terms without political conditions. Resource loss marked the beginning of rapid imperial decline, regardless of military capabilities or diplomatic efforts to maintain control. Venezuela, the modern resource transfer. Venezuela's pivot represents the largest single transfer of energy resources from Western to Eastern control since the 1973 oil crisis, but this time the transfer is permanent rather than temporary. The scale of the transfer. Venezuela's proven oil reserves of 304 billion barrels represent 17.5% of global reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, Russia, or any other single country. The $340 billion consortium agreement gives China, Russia, and India preferential access to these reserves for 25 years, with options for extension. But the agreement goes beyond simple oil sales. It includes infrastructure development, refinery construction, transportation systems, and financial services that create permanent economic integration between Venezuela and the Eastern Consortium, rather than temporary commercial relationships. The strategic implications. Control of Venezuelan oil provides the China-Russia-India Consortium with energy security that reduces their vulnerability to Western sanctions, while giving them leverage over global energy markets during geopolitical tensions. More importantly, Venezuelan oil sales will be denominated in yuan, rubles, and rupees rather than dollars, removing approximately 2.8 million barrels daily from the petrodollar system, equivalent to losing Kuwait, or UAE, from dollar-based energy trade. The technological component. The consortium agreement includes technology transfers for advanced extraction techniques, renewable energy development, and digital payment systems that modernize Venezuelan energy infrastructure, while integrating it into Eastern technological ecosystems. This technological integration creates long-term dependencies that make reversing the relationship extremely difficult, even if future Venezuelan governments wanted to return to Western orientation. The financial architecture. Unlike previous oil deals that used Western banks and insurance companies, the Venezuelan consortium operates through Eastern financial institutions, including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Russian development funds, and Indian export-import financing. This parallel financial architecture handles transactions outside Western oversight while building institutional capacity that supports additional resource transfers, as other countries consider similar arrangements. The wealth transfer mathematics. The Venezuela pivot triggers wealth transfers that extend far beyond the $340 billion contract value, affecting global currency flows, asset prices, and economic relationships worldwide. Direct petrodollar impact. Venezuelan oil represents approximately 1 billion barrels annually in export capacity. At current prices, this equals roughly $70 billion in annual export revenue, moving from dollar settlements to alternative currency systems. Over the 25-year contract period, this represents $1.175 trillion in energy trade, moving outside the petrodollar system, reducing automatic demand for dollars while increasing demand for yuan, rubles, and rupees. Currency reserve implications. Countries purchasing Venezuelan oil through the consortium will need to maintain currency reserves in yuan, rubles and rupees rather than dollars. This creates structural demand for Eastern currencies, while reducing demand for dollar reserves. Preliminary analysis suggests the Venezuela pivot could drive $200–400 billion in central bank reserve reallocation over the next 5 years as energy importing nations adjust their currency holdings to match their trade relationships. Capital flow, redirection, infrastructure development, technology transfers, and financial services associated with the consortium agreement will create approximately $150 billion in additional economic activity within the Eastern sphere rather than Western economies. This represents jobs, profits, and technological advancement occurring in Eastern economies that would traditionally have benefited Western companies and workers involved in global energy development. Asset price implications. The permanent transfer of Venezuelan oil from Western to Eastern control affects global asset valuations across multiple sectors. Energy company stocks. Western oil majors lose access to Venezuelan reserves, while Eastern energy companies gain long-term supply security. Currency values. Reduced petrodollar flows, weakened dollar demand while strengthening Eastern currencies. Commodity prices. Eastern control of additional oil reserves provides leverage in global energy markets. Bond markets. Reduced dollar demand from energy trade affects treasury demand and interest rates. The acceleration of multipolarity. Venezuela's resource transfer represents more than bilateral commerce. It demonstrates that the multipolar world order has reached sufficient organizational capacity to handle large-scale resource transfers without Western institutional involvement. Alternative financial infrastructure. The consortium agreement operates entirely through Eastern financial institutions, demonstrating that alternatives to Western banks, insurance companies, and payment systems can handle complex international transactions. The success of this arrangement provides a template for other resource-rich countries considering similar pivots away from Western economic integration. Technology integration, Chinese industrial technology, Russian energy expertise, and Indian engineering capabilities combine to provide comprehensive development services that rival or exceed what Western companies traditionally offered. This technological integration creates self-reinforcing relationships where Eastern consortium members become increasingly valuable partners for resource development, while Western alternatives become less essential. Military security arrangements. The consortium agreement includes security provisions where Russian naval assets and Chinese Coast Guard capabilities provide protection for Venezuelan energy infrastructure and shipping routes. These security arrangements create permanent military presence that makes reversing the resource transfer extremely difficult, while demonstrating Eastern capacity to protect their economic interests globally. Regional integration. Venezuela's Eastern pivot encourages similar arrangements throughout Latin America as countries recognize successful alternatives to traditional Western economic relationships. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile have already signed preliminary agreements for increased economic cooperation with consortium members, suggesting regional reorientation toward Eastern economic integration. The timeline of imperial transition. Based on historical patterns and current acceleration rates, here's how the debt empire collapse cycle will likely complete over the next decade. 2026-2027, resource transfer. Acceleration. Additional countries follow Venezuela's example by transferring critical resource relationships from Western to Eastern partners. This phase features continued Western political influence, while economic relationships shift systematically eastward. 2027-2029, financial system. Bifurcation. Eastern alternative financial systems reach sufficient scale to handle major international transactions independent of Western institutions. Trade increasingly occurs through multiple currency systems rather than dollar-dominated arrangements. 2029-2031. Recognition and adaptation. Western political and business leaders acknowledge the permanent nature of multipolar transition while adjusting to reduced global influence. This phase typically features domestic reforms and economic restructuring as imperial benefits disappear. 2031-2035. New equilibrium. The multipolar system becomes fully operational with no single power, holding dominant global position. International relations operate through multiple power centers, with shifting alliances based on practical interests rather than ideological alignment. What this means for everyone, the Venezuela catalyzed transition from unipolar American dominance to multipolar global order affects everyone differently depending on their position within existing economic and political systems. For Americans, imperial transition means adjustment to living standards more closely aligned with actual productive capacity rather than financial privilege derived from monetary dominance. However, it also reduces international responsibilities and risks associated with maintaining global empire. The key challenge will be political adaptation, as domestic constituencies adjust to reduced international influence while developing economic strategies based on genuine comparative advantages rather than financial manipulation. For Western allies, countries like Germany, Japan, and South Korea face choices between maintaining political alignment with declining American influence or pursuing economic opportunities with rising Eastern powers. The most successful Western allies will likely diversify their economic relationships while maintaining cultural and political ties to Western institutions, creating balanced approaches that provide options during transition periods. For emerging economies, the multipolar transition provides opportunities for countries to pursue development strategies aligned with their national interests rather than requirements imposed by dominant powers. Access to Eastern technology, financing, and markets creates alternatives that allow emerging economies to avoid structural adjustment programs and conditional lending that previously limited their development options. For global stability, historical evidence suggests that multipolar systems are typically more stable than unipolar dominance, because they prevent any single power's problems from creating global crises while providing multiple centers of innovation and development. The transition period may feature increased volatility as old systems dissolve and new systems emerge, but the end result should provide better global stability and more balanced development opportunities. The Venezuela pivot is not just about oil. It's about the fundamental reorganization of global power relationships around multiple centers of influence rather than single power dominance. This transition was historically inevitable once America chose financial manipulation over productive investment as the foundation of its global influence. The debt empire collapse cycle has reached its terminal phase. The resource transfers have begun. The multipolar future is emerging. Understanding this transition provides the framework for navigating successfully through the most significant reorganization of global power relationships since World War II. The old order is ending. The new order is beginning. The choice is adaptation or irrelevance.